Let's talk about mighty tanks, devastating artillery, and waves of infantry with las guns and bayonets, with an overview of starting the Imperial Guard in 10th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Astra Militarum once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of starting the Guard in the 10th edition of the game, covering why you might want to start a Guard army in the first place, some ideas for planning out a Guard army, and the different themes or tropes that you could go down, some ideas for first miniature purchases and ways to expand to, and a few thoughts on rules for the faction and one example army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it, with an overview of collecting the Hammer of the Emperor. First up, why would you want to collect Astra Militarum in the first place, also known as the Glorious Emperor's Imperial Guard? The Astra Militarum really are quite different within Warhammer 40k to most of the other factions, mass ranks of mortal human soldiers, defending the galaxy from the endless alien and chaos horrors of Warhammer 40k. They are perhaps the faction that's the most obviously relatable to normal humans right now, being sent into the fight with distinctly average tools, just one amongst many, willing to lay down their lives to hold back the darkness and stop the Imperium descending into chaos. Thematically, the Guard tend to favour a more traditional military structure than most Warhammer armies out there, generally being styled around sort of 20th century military. Plenty of fairly recognisable infantry, tanks and artillery that aren't so enormously different from real world tropes, even if they might have some notably Warhammer aesthetics such as sponsons and guns of ludicrous calibers. On top of that though, as it's 40k, they've got Scout Walker Sentinels, plasma guns, and cavalry fighting with melter spears, plus plenty of Imperial icons and insignia all over the place. Different Guard regiments really vary quite a lot between each other, drawn from different areas of the galaxy and homeworlds, and are sort of well known for fighting in their own styles, wearing different kit, and while they might not be the most elite force in the world, they can often bring quantity rather than quality. Massive chunky tanks, huge infantry formations, declaring bayonet charges, and if they can't go one-to-one with fancy space marines and things, they might be able to pound them into dust with artillery. Miniature-wise, the Astra Militarum have one of 40k's oldest, biggest and most established miniature ranges. They've had a recent range refresh focusing on the Cadian shock troops, meaning that the core of the army is a lot more up-to-date than it was a couple of years back at least, though they do still have some older options within the range, things like the Kazachan jungle fighters for example, and a few of the older vehicles. For quite a while, Games Workshop had a bunch of different metal miniature ranges, representing maybe a few of the slightly less mainstream regiments out of there, like Valhallan Ice Warriors or Talon Desert Raiders. Though a while back they went away, the main ones on offer at the moment are the Cadian Shock Troops, Kazachan Jungle Fighters, and Death Corps of Krieg. If you want different stylings beyond them, you might have to look beyond Games Workshop with third-party manufacturers these days. Otherwise, they're one of the armies that still has one of the biggest Forge World miniature ranges out there, in more expensive resin with big fancy tanks and other cool toys, though they do look to be gradually phased out in Warhammer 40k. In terms of miniatures this edition, they are expected to have a fairly major miniature release with their 10th edition codex. Taking a look at a few of the models in their range, here on the top left we have the iconic battle tank, the Lehman Russ, this one a Punisher version with a Gatling cannon. On the bottom left we've got some Cadian shock troops, plus an officer commanding them here with the power sword and plasma pistol. In the centre we've got a chunky armoured sentinel armed with a plasma cannon. On the top right, a fearsome Death Strike missile launcher, one of the various artillery systems they have, and on the bottom right an Attilan Rough Rider, kind of harking back to more ancient era cavalry there, a big chunky armoured horse. Otherwise the Guard have abhuman auxilia like these ogre-like Borgrin here. There's a commissar standing at the front, perhaps as scary to your own forces as they are to the enemy, known to execute any deserters on sight. On the bottom right we've got a heavy weapon team with a heavy bolter, and looming at the back there we've got the enormous Baneblade super heavy tank, a veritable rolling fortress of steel, absolutely covered in guns. Within the Guard range they also have this small sub-range of Militarum Tempestus Scions, fancy Spec Ops stormtroopers that often tend to drop in on grav shoots, and they've got this Taurox Prime as their dedicated transport vehicle. And as mentioned, the Guard do have a big Forge World range. Games Workshop has been slowly chipping away and making things go out of production, so my hope wouldn't be amazing for these surviving into the long term. Here on the left though we've got a great big tank in the Macarius Heavy Tank, and on the right we have a Death Rider of Krieg, a different style clawed hoofed cavalry choice, hopefully might be redone in plastic at some point. Perhaps one of the biggest downsides to collecting Guard, at least if you're going through Games Workshop's plastic kits, is price. Historically, the Astra Militarum are one of the most expensive armies that you can collect in 40k, as you just need a whole load of miniatures to put on the table. Given it's sort of their lore that most of their forces aren't really very elite, particularly their infantry models, they won't really get you very many points on the table for how much money you spent, though a few of the tanks and heavier vehicles can be a bit better on that front. These Cadian shock troops, for example, are 1.2 points per dollar right now, which really is very low by 40k standards. Finally, for the Guard, we have their gameplay. You can find their rules in Index Astra Militarum, and in general they tend to be a fairly ranged focused army, cheapish hardy infantry to screen the tanks and take the midfield objectives, backed up by powerful guns that often tend to be the ones that do the main damage, and a bit of artillery for some devastating precision fire just where it's needed. There's certainly quite a few slightly different tropes that you can do within the Guard, as we'll get onto in a second, but otherwise their main army themes is they tend to have a command structure with orders, giving your forces different powerful boosts in different ways issued by the officers. The detachment rule favours shooting when you're stationary, and at the moment top lists tend to have a fairly good balance between tanks, infantry and artillery, all of them being useful but maybe not so great that you want an entire army of them. Currently, in terms of army performance, they're sort of weakish on the general power spectrum of 40k. Win rates are around about 45% or so. A few top players were managing to win some big tournaments with them, though I feel like given that the list that they were using that with has been hit quite hard, that might drop off a bit. 40k game balance does tend to ebb and flow though, so it's not exactly the biggest deal in the world in my opinion. In any case, if you want an army of plucky normal humans with regiments that you can really make your own, and some big heavy and dangerous tanks to put on the table, the Astra Militarum might be for you. If you do choose to join the ranks of the Imperial Guard, there's plenty of places that you can go to find out a little bit more about the faction. Obviously, it's not the worst place to start to take a look over Index Astra Militarum. That's got the unit profiles and rules from Games Workshop. They're in the Warhammer 40k download section on Warhammer Community. The current versions of the codex that you might find second-hand and things will be out of date at the moment. They say the 9th edition one still might not be the worst for getting to look over lore and things, but the rules in it won't be right. Otherwise, for messing around with army lists, you could think about things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, and Warhapedia for seeing how units could go together in a conceivable collection. And before you even think about getting miniatures yourself, you could think about trying to proxy models to try before you buy a little bit, or go for Tabletop Simulator if you're into that kind of thing. Here on YouTube, there's a pretty vast amount of Imperial Guard and Astra Militarum content, of course. I've made an index overview, a video rating some units and looking over some army lists and things. I'm sure I'll have more to come at some point or another. There's battle reports, painting guides, and lore in abundance on all kinds of other channels though. Just searching Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum into the search bar will give you a whole bunch of stuff. I'd certainly recommend checking out Morty and Glory's channel if you're new to the faction. Just a massive amount of content dedicated to the Guard, loads of unit reviews, battle reports and tactic videos and plenty more. Otherwise, I'd certainly recommend checking out Guard's social media. Most 40k factions have Discord servers, Facebook groups, and subreddits. Can just be nice places to ask a few basic questions if you're new, or just follow along with what other hobbyists are looking at and talking about. You can learn quite a lot by osmosis. Otherwise, beyond that, it's worth having a think about what sort of Guard army you'd like to wind up with, say after you've been collecting the faction for a year or so. Early on in the process, it's worth just thinking about drafting out a rough 1000 point or 2000 point list just to give yourself an idea of where you might be headed with the army, and what sort of factions and things you might need to pick up if you want to get there along the way. Can just give you a bit more overall direction than picking up individual units one by one. Otherwise though, I would say that the Astra Militarum are perhaps one of the armies in Warhammer 40k that have got some of the most obvious distinctive ways to play. Lots of different army archetypes that you could skew into really quite heavy, where one Guard army could be very different from the next. I'd say that most average players tend to just build fairly balanced, having elements of multiple things with the army, like a bit of artillery, some armoured vehicles, some infantry, maybe some transports and specialists, maybe just going for a bit more of a general purpose feel to the force, as opposed to going really heavily one way. You definitely can try and build out to make one or more element of the force into really quite a major one that you could fill most of an army with. Perhaps best examples are things like Foot Guard with a big horde of las guns on the table, mechanized infantry jumping out of chimeras or Tauroxes, a tank company with a scary amount of Lehman Rosses, maybe backed up with some Dawns or Baneblades, perhaps trying to build around Tempestus Scions, or maybe going artillery heavy, perhaps lots of indirect fire and heavy guns with some infantry to screen. I have a feeling that at least some of those tropes are probably going to get their own detachment support when the Guard Codex comes out. That usually seems to be the way that things go for 10th edition these days. Another option for theming a Guard army is what sort of regiment you're going to be collecting. In 10th edition, paint and things is mostly for theming as opposed to giving or taking gaming rules, though the Guard do operate a little bit differently to the rest. Their regiments tend to be really quite different in equipment and feel to each other, that they've generally had different miniatures to each other in the past. You can see a good chunk of the more major ones on screen now. Technically at the moment, a few datasheets do actually key off your choice of regiment miniatures. The Death Corps of Krieg, the Kaschan Jungle Fighters, and the Cadian Shock Troops all get their own infantry datasheets within the index, though in my experience, and for what I do myself, people tend to be a bit more likely just to pick one style of infantry and then just go with it, and maybe mark the different types of squads with different shoulder pads and things like that, and just make sure that the actual weapons and things are converted to be consistent. You certainly could draw a force from multiple different regiments, though. It does happen in the lore from time to time. So you could have some Kriegsmen fighting alongside Cadians and Kaschans if you wanted to have some sort of big combined force. Otherwise, though, there's a lot of cool backstory to dig into. The blasted desert world of Talon with its great tank confrontations, the Vostroyan Firstborn conscripted from the firstborn sons of the nobles and sent out into the galaxy with their heirloom weapons, the sadly fallen world of Cadia, or the hard-bitten Kaschan jungle fighters, where every day on the battlefield is a walk on the park compared with surviving on their home death world. As mentioned, the 5 on the right of this screen at the moment, you'd have to either find third-party miniatures or convert things to counters them, though it's not impossible that Games Workshop might realise some of them in plastic in the distant future. In general, when picking an army, I decide whether you're building balanced or going with a bit of a theme. Decide what sort of regiment that you're playing with, whether you're going to mainly theme around Cadians, Kaschans, or Death Corps, and then you can think about whether or not they're going to be a more standard regiment from that kind of system, or a very different one with your own theme and colouring. I'd likely start by painting up a test model with an infantry guardsman with a las gun of some sort, maybe a Cadian shock trooper if you're going for that, something that's relatively small and manageable, and it's not going to be the biggest deal to repaint if you mess it up somehow. Generally, I'd say that the Astra Militarum aren't the hardest to paint up in the world compared with others. For infantry and things, I've tended to go with spraying in the more primary colour of their armour, then go with shading the cloth, maybe doing a little bit of washing and dry brushing to bring it out a little bit, and shading in the recesses of armour plates. They can be done alright with contrast paints, I think. The vehicles can have a lot of rivets on them, so might lend themselves a little bit better to dry brushing than some other techniques. Plus, a fair few people like to have a bit of a go at camo patterns of one sort or another. There's really quite a lot of good painting guides, both online and here on YouTube. Games Workshop have quite a few themselves, but there's also loads from other creators too. As mentioned, you really don't have to stick to the prescribed regiment colours that we saw on the previous screen. You could go with trying to make up a regiment from the lore, or just completely go with your own colours, maybe have Cadians but paint the armour in red for example, and go with a different sort of cloth colour. There's been a bit of a long-standing theme with Games Workshop saying that the Cadian regimental kit is copied by a whole bunch of other armies throughout the galaxy, perhaps going as a bit of an in-universe lore explanation for why those miniatures are quite so commonly seen for the Guard. Otherwise, talking of models, let's get into first purchases and ideas for collecting miniatures. If you're going through Games Workshop's plastic kits, I'd currently start with the combat patrol for Astra Militarum, or perhaps an infantry squad of your chosen regiment, be it Cadian, Kaschan, or Krieg. The reason people often get recommended the combat patrol to start with is because these are Games Workshop's discount box sets. So basically for the kits that you can see pictured here, typically Games Workshop would charge a fair bit more for if they were sold individually. The Guard one comes with 2 sets of Cadian shock troops, 1 Cadian command squad to give them orders and things, a couple of field ordnance batteries for some heavy fire support, and a sentinel that you can build as either a scout or armoured sentinel. This one does give you a pretty good discount compared with buying separately, around about 39% off what you pay for these kits separately if you bought them via Games Workshop, though as is typical for Guard kits that tend to focus on the infantry and lighter vehicle type things, you really don't get many points in the box here. It's only 365. That's certainly on the lower end of the spectrum for the combat patrol box sets out there. In general, I'd say that the field ordnance batteries are perhaps a little bit underpowered. Sentinels are pretty great though, as are the command squads. The Cadian shock troops I'd say probably aren't the optimal troops choice right now, though as said, if you build up a fair amount of infantry with the right amounts of equipment and things, you certainly can run them as different variants by just clearly marking one squad from another. In general, I'd rate the miniatures as really quite nice ones. These ones all came from the recent Guard range refresh at the end of 9th edition, so are some of the most up-to-date Guard models that Games Workshop have made. Just for a few thoughts on assembly for the miniatures in the combat patrol box, I'd quite likely go plasma and melter on the infantry, maybe the grenade launcher if you wanted a bit more range. That's if you're running them as Cadian shock troops, of course. I'd probably go for the bombast field guns on the field ordnance batteries. I feel like they're in the awkward spot where they're kind of costed for the bombast guns, and it means that the las cannons and the missile launchers are paying a bit of a premium because of them. The Sentinel, I'd certainly recommend magnetising the main weapon if you can be bothered to. If not, perhaps the las cannon isn't the worst idea, and I'd think about leaving that carapace bit on top of it on glues. The kit's built in such a way that you can slip the armoured bit on and off, depending on whether or not you want to field it as a scout sentinel or armoured sentinel. Otherwise, currently for the command squad, I'd likely build all the specialists, the Vox, the Banner, and the Medic, give the company commander a Power Fist, and maybe do a special weapon for the last guy, maybe a Plasma or a Melter once again. While we get into the subject of buying 40k miniatures, I think it's always worth reminding people of the different ways that you can do so in these start collecting videos. Direct from Games Workshop's own Warhammer web store tends to be the most reliable way of landing plastic kits, though it's also the most expensive. I'd usually see it as a fallback option compared with discount retailers, either local gaming stores or online retailers, who are basically officially allowed to sell the same thing but at a fair bit cheaper, usually doing 10 to 20% off Warhammer depending on where you are around the world. I do have a few examples of those linked in the video description. Element Games for 15% off in the UK, Gap Games for 21% off in Australia, Fenris Workshop for 10% off in Canada, and Wargame Portal for 15% off in the USA. Those ones are affiliate links and do help support the channel for any of you choosing to use those, though there are plenty of other good options around the world available, of course. New plastic kits certainly aren't the end of the story though. The second-hand market is something I'd certainly really recommend for the Astra Militarum. eBay can definitely be worth a look for rank and file infantry and things. Quality can be kind of variable, but you potentially can save a lot of time, effort, and certainly a lot of money. You are likely to find a lot of the older style Cadian infantry in good numbers there. The sculpts are quite a lot more dated now, but if that's not something that enormously concerns you, then that can be a much more economical way to get a whole load of infantry on the table. It's certainly how I built up to a good number myself so I could field Horde Guard lists. Otherwise, in this day and age as well, there's a whole ton of 3D printed and third-party manufacturers out there. Loads of great alternative sculpts for essentially humans in space with various different real-world military aesthetics tagged on. This can be a great option if you're trying to build up to some regiments that Games Workshop hasn't really supported properly, so certainly plenty of options there. Otherwise, for kind of central kits to the army, I think it's worth mentioning the Lehman Russ. This one's the iconic battle tank of the Imperial Guard, and Games Workshop does tend to aim for it to be one of the better damage dealers of the faction, as if it gets underpowered, people are a bit disappointed that their mainline battle tank isn't doing very much. I've certainly got a massive amount of my Lehman Russes that are magnetised over the years. Again, I really would recommend it if you can get round to the bother of doing so, as it just means that you've got a tank that can then be swapped out to different things between one game or the other, or if the rules change round and you might want to try out something different. You might not even necessarily need to bother magnetising for things like the sponson weapons and the whole mounted weapon. They can fit kind of snugly with friction as it is. I would say that probably if you want to glue stuff in at the moment, it might be multi-melters or plasma cannons that would be my first choice. Most people tend to use the las cannon on the whole at the moment as well. Otherwise, for the main gun, most of the weapons are at least fairly usable right now. Quite a lot of people quite like Demolisher tank commanders. Though following the points reductions, most of the rest really are quite usable, but at least fairly balanced and quite good at taking out different targets that they specialise in. Otherwise, for starting armies with a bang, past discount sets like the Christmas Battle Forces, such as the Cadian Defence Force from Christmas 2023, or the Bastion Platoon, which I think was the year before. They can be interesting options for getting a lot of force on the table quite quickly. Supply of these will be really quite limited though, but it could be alright if you can get them somewhere near their original price. If you can't, then it might just not really be worth the faff, and you may as well just pick up miniatures that you choose individually. Otherwise, for alternative options for the Guard, one kit that it's probably worth being aware of is the Solar Auxilia. This one's a pretty recent range of models aimed at Warhammer the Horus Heresy. It's kind of similar to the Astra Militarum's equivalent then. If you wanted a Guard regiment of a different sort of theming, then these guys could stand in quite well. They basically have las guns and more sort of industrial looking armour that I think is really quite cool with those void suits there. Plus, weirdly enough, if you just want las guns on the board, Games Workshop also seem to sell them cheaper here versus the other kits like the Cadian Shock Troops or the Death Corps Veterans. It's $75 for 20 Solar Auxilia here versus $50 for 10 Cadian Shock Troops, though I guess you might get those via the combat patrol, so maybe direct comparison doesn't entirely make sense there. They do have a few fun alternative stylings for things like Lehman Rosses. Some of them translate maybe a little bit better than others though. You might need to do something about making some sponsons for the Heresy era ones for the Solo Auxilia, as they don't come with those. Otherwise, probably my first port of call would be a Combat Patrol, maybe a Lehman Ross or two, maybe any other discount deals that you could get your hands on. I thought I'd just talk through a few options to expand the army. Chimeras can generally be handy enough to deploy squads to the midboard, can be nice with Kaschan jungle fighters to scout move them, and just in general I think they're really quite efficient as transports, both really tough and maybe packing a surprising amount of anti-infantry firepower for what they are. The Rogel Dawn battle tank is the bigger brother of the Lehman Ross, a more recent kit, this one coming out in 9th edition, a great big oppressor cannon and then covered in all sorts of other guns with sponsons and hull mounted stuff. This one does get a fair few points on the board, though does cost a bit more. Tempestus Scions can be handy enough to have in small numbers, nicely dropping down and dealing damage with their special weapons, and are quite nice for secondary objectives. The Basilisk could be a good example of an artillery piece right now. It did go up in points recently, though I think it's still good. Just provides a bit of general purpose damage dealing fire support with strength 8 and damage 2. And perhaps more importantly, in some matchups, it can slow down infantry units, meaning that one unit that you hit is -2 to move, advance, and charge, potentially stopping opponents from reaching your lines or getting to objectives. 4 leaders for the army, currently Lord Solar Leontus and Ursula Creed are both quite good. Lord Solar gives you command points and is basically the god of orders. In general, his miniature maybe wasn't particularly well received by the community though, as he does have quite a different aesthetic to the guard that he's leading. I have seen quite a few people convert alternatives. Ursula Creed can be quite nice to stick in a squad with a mortar. She means that you can put down the Fields of Fire stratagem for free each turn, debuffing one enemy unit for -1 AP, which can be kind of brutal against things that rely on high saves. Gaunt's Ghost can be a fun little unit of commandos popping up around the board to deal a bit of pinpoint damage, hand out some orders, and maybe do secondary objectives if needed. And for some examples of some chunky abhumans to have on the front lines, there's the Borgren. I'd be tempted to give them the Borgren Mauls and the Invulnerable Save Brute Shields at the moment, and they give you a unit with a fair bit of counterpunch muscle for the enemy army, and squads that can survive quite well on midfield objectives, even if they're subjected to a fair amount of punishment. In general though, when expanding an army, there's always loads of room for just collecting what you like the look of. 40k rules do change over time, and will continue to with balance updates. I would say at time of recording the vast majority of the index is at least usable, which is more than you can say for some factions. I think most people would likely to build up a balanced core army list and then add elements that interest you more, either because you like the models or you like the fun rules that they have in game. Maybe just for some idea of what a more balanced guard army list might look like at around 2 to 3,000 points, you could maybe start with a combat patrol, build up to around about a total of 30 to 60 infantry unless you're going big horde guard, maybe eventually work your way towards 3 Rosses and a Rogue or Dawn, perhaps 2 to 3 copies of Sentinels or Chimeras, and maybe add in some artillery pieces of your choice, some support units if interested, things like Auxilia, Scions or Kazakin, and maybe Lord Solar, Creed, and Gaunt's Ghost can be nice to have for current competitive lists. That's absolutely just a rough idea though. It wouldn't be something that I'd just rush off and buy. I'd give yourself a rough plan of what you might want to aim for at say a 2,000 point army and work towards it gradually, playing games and adapting as you go, and buying sustainably rather than just picking up everything all at once. Finally, talking rules for the Guard. Currently indexed Astra Militarum is freely downloadable on the Warhammer Community Download section under Warhammer 40K. Otherwise though, there are other rule sources that can reference things like Warhapedia or Games Workshop's app. Official points costs are currently found in the Munitorum Field Manual download in that same section. You can also find the Forge World side of the army in the download section as well. That's a little bit further down under Imperial Armor. Currently you could find some index reference cards to pick up, little flashcards that you can have to hand to reference the rules of the army in game. They should be good until whenever the codex comes out in 10th edition. Maybe not strictly necessary, but a quite nice quality of life thing that a fair few people do choose to go with. For the 10th edition Guard Codex release, we don't know when it's going to be out yet. It's suspected that it won't be at least until autumn 2024, though it could be far later. It's not officially announced by Games Workshop at time of recording. The Codex will certainly change things quite a lot for the army. The main edition will be different detachments, so another fair few ways to play. As mentioned, I feel like we'll get some dedicated support for things like tank companies, maybe mechanised infantry or horde foot guard, potentially some more, and they might throw in a bit of theming around the regiments added on. I certainly not wait for this though to get started. Warhammer 40k rules are changing quite frequently anyway, and it makes far more sense to have built up a more well-rounded collection before that happens to actually get good use out of the codex when it comes. As mentioned, Guard are suspected to get a fairly good release wave of new models with the codex, though we don't know 100% for sure if that's happening or what those kits might be. Otherwise though, in the meantime in-game, their core army rule is the voice of command, the orders that you can see here on the right. The officers of the force command their units usually within 6 inches of them, and you can give them things like extra movement with move for plus 3 inches to how far your squads can move across the board, or things like take aim for a +1 to hit. Lord Solar often tends to be the source of these for a lot of competitive lists, given that he can order everything, including exotic things like big tanks, tank commanders, or auxilia. Otherwise, the core regiment rule for the combined regiment is born soldiers. Each time an Astra Militarum unit shoots, if it remains stationary, then you get lethal hits. Tends to be a little bit situational and far more helpful for the artillery versus the rest of the things, though it does mean that if there's any one turn where it makes sense just to sit and shoot, then your force gets a lot more scary, particularly against big toughness targets, things like enemy vehicles or monsters. Otherwise, for a few more notable rules within the detachment, there's Grand Strategist. That's an enhancement that can allow an officer model to order once more. Can be nice on tank commanders or maybe company command squads. And two of the more important stratagems might be Fields of Fire, 2 CP for regiment or squadron models to get an extra AP-1 against your target. Quite a powerful debuff if you're focusing lots of tanks and artillery on your luckless foe. And certainly the reinforcement stratagem is quite nice. 2 CP for a destroyed regiment units to be put back into strategic reserve. In theory, it means that you could potentially lose a squadron of 3 sentinels and have them return to the board in later turns, or other big, fairly high value targets, such as 10 Tempestus Scions or 20 Death Corps of Krieg or Cadian shock troops, for example. Finally, just for one example force of how you could put Imperial Guard on the table and what it might look like. Here's just a rough army that's not exactly optimized, but maybe it isn't too terrible, starting out from a combat patrol box set, and just adding in a fair few different elements of the army that could make for a fairly effective guard force. Leading the force, we've got those trio of characters I mentioned before, Lord Solar Leontus to do the orders. He'd be paired with a platoon command squad from the combat patrol box, and they'd be joining a Death Corps of Krieg unit. If you combine Leontus and the platoon command squad within the same infantry unit, then he can broadcast his orders extra far with a Master Vox, and potentially have them affecting targets quite a long way away. Otherwise, we've got 2 units of 10 Kazachan jungle fighters for some scouting into the midboard, one of them riding in a Chimera with 2 heavy flamers to get them to an objective fast, and then there's Ursula Creed with a bunch of Cadian shock troops with melter guns and plasma guns. Can be a bit of a second wave onto the midfield objectives potentially, handing out fields of fire to the single foe that she most needs to get destroyed. Otherwise, for some big guns, we've got 2 tank commanders. They're equipped with demolisher cannons, multi-melters and las cannons, so are going to be some of the best damage dealers against enemy armor, and can also order some of the other vehicles in the list. They'll be backed up by a fearsome Rogel Dawn, taking a pressure cannon, pulverizer cannon and melter sponsons. There's a Manticore and a Basilisk for a bit of artillery support. They'd be ordered by Lord Solar and might try and coordinate with whatever's got fields of fire on it. Plus there's 2 Scout Sentinels to mark the way and keep them extra accurate, as well as just being tough annoying vehicles armed with las cannons for yet more firepower. Finally, for a little bit of objective support, there's a Gaunt's Ghosts to be able to jump around the board doing secondaries, a unit of Tempestus Scions that can be a cheap unit to drop for objectives, and some Bullgrins just to skirmish over the midboard, potentially bogging down and tying up some enemy infantry units, maybe taking out some lighter ones. The only thing I wound up not using from the Combat Patrol box set were the field ordnance batteries in this one. You certainly could swap them out for one of the Manticore or Basilisk though, and maybe get something else with the leftover points. In any case, hopefully between all that it gives you a few ideas as to collecting and expanding an Imperial Guard army right now. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Feel free to let me know any other tips that you've got for expanding your force from any other Guard generals out there. If you'd like something else to watch, then I'll link my Imperial Guard unit review video down in the video description. A few of the points costs have changed slightly since that, but it should be broadly accurate beyond that. And otherwise feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I'm sure there'll be more for the Guard in due course. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.